name's Oscar Quintanilla. I'm a second year planning student at GSD. And the title of my thesis, working title, is Unintended Manawa Deliberate Planning Decisions. And trying to understand the city today, like, with what happened before and what decisions were made. So in 1972, there was an earthquake that destroyed 75% of the buildings of the city and displaced 250,000 people. So what happened following this disaster and how that relates to long-term planning, kind of like the general topic. So my question is, why is it that what used to be the most valuable land in the city, as you saw in the picture before, is the same street, is still mostly vacant, and 40 years after the earthquake? Like, why? What used to be the downtown, what all the economic activity and like city life was, still mostly vacant. And you see, like, kind of a little bit of context. So Nicaragua, it's like in the middle of the Americas. It's a very small country. It has like 5.6 million inhabitants, and the city itself is like 900,000. If you take into account the metropolitan area, it's like 2.5 million. And that little square in this final map is what used to be the downtown. And you see how the city started like sprawling after the earthquake. So trying to understand the dynamics. Why this particular case is interesting to me, or to most people? Well, there's like a lot of history between city planning and disasters and recovery and resilience, and how like the Chicago fire in 1871 or the earthquake in San Francisco or Mexico City, how these cities use this opportunity to rebuild the core and denser with higher buildings and with more activities. And so like, why this particular case, instead of using this opportunity that nature gave them to rebuild and be denser, instead of urban renewal, or like in China, they did a clearing the historic districts to make it denser, why it's still vacant and it's still built in the city? And like, Guatemala suffered an earthquake in 1976, and they did rebuild denser and around their core. And like the other city that's like my neighbor to Nicaragua is in Costa Rica, and they didn't have any major disaster, but they are built in denser. So like, it's not a geographical, it's not cultural. Why? What are the politics or the implications behind it? So before the earthquake, it was like a bustling capital city. It was pretty dense, as you can see here. There were like 4 or 5-story buildings, and all the economic activity and the like residents and like city government and national government buildings were all in the same area. And the earthquake pretty much cleared this like very dense core. The tallest building at the time was this Bank of America recently built. So it had all the technology to support an earthquake. So it was kind of the only building that remained in usable condition. The other building was demolished. But all this downtown active core was cleared, and then people were like 250,000 homeless residents were displaced and relocated outside of the city. And what happened, one of the things that happened was that there was a national decree to block this area and prohibit any construction right after the earthquake, because they were still studying like if it was possible to rebuild or if the geological conditions permitted and so on. But 20 years later, today, here's the Bank of America building still, and all the rest around it is pretty much vacant. And this is recent. This is like 3 or 4 years ago. Affordable housing. They're using this, what used to be the most valuable land in the city, to have affordable housing, back with big plazas. And all this area is just underutilized. And you still have government offices, national government offices right there. So I believe that contemporary land use patterns of the city is constrained by planning decisions made right after the earthquake and the years following. And these decisions, intended or not, can inform current plans for the city and its metropolitan region. Kind of like the frontier of knowledge of why I'm going into this thesis. Well, there was a lot of like research right after the earthquake of what happened and what was the response and what consequences it had on city living conditions. So there's like a lot of studies about the event itself. There's also a lot of studies about the institutional framework, how like it used to be a national district, then it became a municipality, then it became like an elected official before it was appointed by the president. So there's a lot of research and studies about what were the laws and the regulations and how they changed throughout time. And also there's a lot of thinking about the existing problems of the city, like what are the main constraints, the main problems, and there's like data about it. But then my question is, why aren't they superimposed? Like what can the national political framework tell you about the current conditions, and what can that tell you about the disaster response, and vice versa? Like, so kind of like in the middle, like you have institutional changes, you have the disaster response and the consequences, but you also have present problems, urban problems. So how can we inform and understand the current plans for the city, take into account this? So kind of real quick through my methodology, read about all the reports and analysis that have been done, go to the original plans to understand the motivations behind these decisions, like why did the city decide to block this downtown core and instead invest in the outskirts and towards the sprawl? What were the laws and regulations? And also try to do some field work about like existing conditions and how it feels like after this, and how then throughout history, how the physical changes are informed by institutional changes made during that period. So like, kind of like the sprawl of the city from 1967 to 2005, and how all these different parts of the puzzle can help you understand how we get into that. And finally, why I got really involved in this is because most of today's problems are justified by climate change, by population growth, but is it really about that? Like, weren't there like very specific planning decisions made that actually are more responsible to have every year flooding or unsustainable transportation systems or low density housing, lack of water, instead of, so is there planning, was planning responsible for this, or is there, or can we just blame it on climate and population?
Ask me just a, I guess a more factual question. You asked where is downtown on your side, but where is downtown? Is there, does it have kind of any sort of concentrated city center? Are there nodes, or how would you characterize?
So there are nodes, like industrial core is like right there near the airport, but then the commercial core, like that formal commercial is somewhere else, and then the informal market is another place. So there's no center of the city, and like when you try to design any policy around it, there's like no one can find it. And like city government offices are on the opposite side of the city, and like all the growth, it's like coming this way towards the next city down south. So no, there's like no identifiable downtown as like in most other cities.
So maybe another question to add to your already long list of questions is whether actually it was planning decisions before the earthquake, maybe, that were sort of the exception, and maybe the form that took place after the earthquake was sort of more the form that, not that was inevitable, of course, because everything was planned, but you might look at this larger question of sort of why there was a downtown there in the first place, and why it, ended up moving elsewhere or taking.
And yeah, especially like at that time, that was like the philosophy of planning.
Right.
Like right after the earthquake, the first response was, let's use this opportunity to like spread it out because density is bad and like it brings poverty in. So
if we're going to be critical of planning that way, and I mean, I'm picking up on the same comment, I think you should also question the modes of analysis and about geology for a moment, but you never showed us a geological section or explained to us what the land really looks like underneath this planning diagram, frankly, that you show. So I would be really, really cautious, and it could open up a great opportunity, I think, to express this differently, because as soon as you work in section, you see the periphery and you see the clearing in the middle, and then you can make connections in another axis that will open up, I think, some of your questions, or at least certainly shed a lot of light on them. I mean, you address the question, what is the geology here? Have you answered that? Have you just looked at a geological survey of this? So can you tell me that?
So there are like 20 faults under the city, and we pretty much, so like it's impossible to find a way. There's like one, they're like coming like this.
Yeah, but you're looking at them in plan, right?
And then what?
Are you looking at them in plan?
No, the geological.
The geology, is it a plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you should.
Yeah.
And then you look at a potentially completely different form of growth associated with the plan.
Where's the, you said planting diagram, what planting diagram?
Like, for me, this kind of spread diagram, sprawl,
Yeah.
and plan,
The non-plan diagram?
this is so I mean, it's like the first presentation where it's like, look, it's growing. I mean, yes,
I see,
but
I
it's
see.
not really giving us any quality
I see.
other than the fact that it's growing, which is a condition, I mean, that it's a kind of like a
Right, right, right. I'm wondering, like, what year did the earthquake happen? 72. So, what, are there plan documents preceding or after
There
that
are.
show the intentions for the city? Like, I think narrative-wise, I think you're making it pretty clear what the intentions was, but I think it would be good to actually see what the institutional side, what were the institutional plans and were they accomplished? Like, is what we're seeing in 2010, 2005, an outcome of a specific set of institutional planning divisions, or is it an outcome of widespread urbanization with no plans? Because one of your questions is why not land, why not in here, why this? But it's kind of unclear how this, the big sprawl, actually, how that has come. If it's just like, kind of like a normal development sprawling out, then I don't know if that.
So what's interesting about it is like there is a plan, and their intention was pretty similar to what happened, but the plan was never followed. So like there was a plan,
So the plan is for decentralization.
yes,
But,
and it was clear, and it was
But-
kind of had
the
that.
plan happened, but not on purpose?
Yes. So the plan was never really followed through because right after the earthquake, there were like more political changes that like there was a revolution in between. So like there was a lot of political changes, but it wasn't like the result is not the plan, but like the intention of decentralization and going towards the southeast, it's happened anyways. So kind of like my research is like what were those decisions and what were the intentions behind them to become what it is.
Who's your advisor?
Dan Davis.
About to say that here.
I think what's still important is trying to figure out how to tie historical problems to what you're going to see on the ground, and figuring out criteria for making them stick together. But I'm not really sure I know how, like, I don't know how to answer that question right now. Like, if you understand the historical problem of why this didn't get rebuilt in the 2 years after the earthquake or whatever, how can you tie that to something that you see on the ground today, which is what you're interested in, right? Is that true? So what will count as proof that not redeveloping the center is affecting the urban conditions in the city today? Do you know what I mean? And so if that's your claim, then what are some of the things that you can start to look for that would start to answer those questions? You know?
Also part of it's probably the asking the so what question in response to your framing question is good, and actually you did a nice job kind of textualizing the presentation after presenting that, but you're not probably just wanting to tell us about one place, but a kind of larger, you need to figure out maybe what your larger question is. Like, is it about the nature of disaster planning, or is it about the nature of planning, or is it about kind of the actual factors that determine urban form? And this happens to be a case where the site was kind of wiped clean and things began again. But you'll want to help. It'll help us, but it would also help you, I think, to figure out, as Lisa said, what is the kind of present question that this will help you to answer.
Well, I'm curious too, like once you, I mean, you set it out in this very provocative way, it's like, there's a mystery to be solved, right? And I guess I'm curious, like once you, maybe it's just like just me as a designer speaking, once you sort of get to the, let's say you get to the bottom of it, like whether planning or, was or was not responsible for this like really weird condition, which is pretty interesting. Then what are you going to do? I guess it's like, at the end of the day, do you offer up policy decisions, or do you ride in on the white horse with a plan that's going to solve? But I don't know exactly yet what your position toward this part of the city is yet. I mean, I assume that you're interested in density, but I'm totally reading between the lines. You can say that.
Yeah, I'm still, that's like where I'm struggling at. How this is the research I want to do, because it helps inform the current planning practice in the city. But in what ways? Is there going to be a plan or policies or that I haven't really decided yet. I'm still looking at it.
I would say just only that we have seen maybe just part of it's like only one perspective, which is from the point of view of the, let's say, the discipline in which we are the department we are. But obviously, usually what happens with urbanism is that it cannot be separated from real life and political changes. So I'm sure that it's absolutely important to know how this line is linked to things that have happened there also, which affects like the social life of the city, which is, living inside these regulations and the buildings. So I don't think you can separate this research from political changes in this context, because obviously you are just focusing on one aspect.
But like, my focus is on the institutional and political changes.
Yeah, but I don't see it, because you just present it like from the point of view of this.
Oh, okay, I get it.
So I don't, you didn't talk at all about it.
Yeah,
Just very.
Yeah, it wasn't intentional not to talk about it. Like, there are so many information I need to go through. Like, because it's unclear. What's like a
You
very
have to have a way through it, otherwise it is overwhelming. And I think it's being suggested that there are certain ways through it, and that helps you just sort of clear, cut the fat and get to the chase. And one of them is through political boundaries. Another one I was suggesting is fault lines and boundaries. I mean, you have a series of lines and all these people are kind of squished between them and adapting to that. And it's very rich with potential, but it isn't manifested. So maybe you have to ask some questions or edit your questions.
Well, I think in a way I get the sense that you do understand some of the questions that are coming up for you, right? Like that I think you present this problem as something quite neat and tidy. Like there's this particular site, destroyed by an earthquake, used to be the central location, the most expensive place. Now, 40 years later, no. So like what happened? But in a way, you're trying to unearth a much more complex story, right? So when you actually get down to it and you're working on your thesis, it will be a tracing through all these political contestation about institutional changes that happened in the interim, what was planned, what stuck, what didn't stick, what was changed. And, I'm sure like Diane can tell you that she's particularly attuned to things like that, so I don't think you're going to miss that, right? What I would stress is just physically speaking, to have a little bit, I would love a little bit more traction on the built environment, because you start with the built environment, but I think maybe this is in a way what you were saying, but I can't imagine how the question can only be on one location, and over a 40-year stretch of time, that the focus still remains on that one site.
I wonder if it's like more like the biography model of doing history, where like you're using, and that's kind of what I think is interesting about this. Like you're using that boundary, and I really like the boundary lines idea, because then if you look at all of the different ways that line has been drawn around that site, it's going to touch every part of the city's political history, geographic or geological conditions, the city beyond it, because you're addressing why those lines got built. And so to me, it seems like if you instrumentalize that one site as a way of looking at the larger picture of the city or something, I think that could work.
Right, like it's a starting point, it's the initial point of the narrative, because it is just a density issue. It doesn't really matter if that particular site is there. Maybe they build another city center somewhere else. Whether or not they build back in that the place where most people lost their homes is not, it does not say anything about the current city as it is. What you could focus on in order to make that particular starting point for communities meaningful is that unearth like how, like you said it's still the administrative center, yet it's not like the population commercial center. Is that what you're? So perhaps there's an idea of institutional memory, like people really want to be living in a place where like 250,000 people lost their homes, and like I'm sure a huge number of people died. Perhaps there's a sense of urban like memories of place that also take part in this, and you can look elsewhere in the city to trace how urbanization and density or non-density or centrality or non-centrality have or have not actually taken place.
One of the things that adds like a different layer of complexity is that where they're building here is like where the water source of the city is, and like they're completely putting in jeopardy their like next 20 years.
That's my point. If you're gonna make a commentary on planning, the way it's planned is not taking into account the geomorphology.
Yeah.
That's clear. So you have to announce that you know what's going on underneath this organization. The water table, the lenses, the fault lines, the topsoil quality in certain places where there's bedrock, I don't know. And then see if planning can move more organically around some of these natural conditions rather than just
Like,
on
for
top of
example-
those two sweet spots.
For example, this is like higher, this is mountain, so now there's no way to control storm water because it just
So
flows.
you have to work in section, but we don't even feel the mountain, right? We're
Yeah.
on top of my mountain. I mean, it's implied by the road.